Chapter 1. Introduction. Why the history of medicine reflects human history. The history of medicine is much more than the history of doctors, remedies, and operations. It is a mirror of the entire history of mankind, because hardly any other area of life shows so clearly how closely progress and suffering, hope and error, faith and knowledge are intertwined. From the first attempts to alleviate diseases with herbs, incantations, or simple tools, to today's high-tech operations and genetic engineering therapies, there is a common thread: the incessant struggle of humans with their own vulnerability. Medicine is born where illness and pain interrupt the experience of life. Even the earliest humans had to deal with injuries, with broken bones after hunting, with infections after bite wounds, or with the dangers of birth and age. These experiences led to the first attempts at healing, which were rooted in myths and rituals as well as in practical observation. Man has always sought an answer to the threat of disease, first in the forces of nature, then in the forces of the gods, and finally in the forces of his own mind. Thus, the history of medicine is also the history of transitions, from the magical to the rational, from explaining to myths to explaining by natural laws. The first doctors were priests, shamans, herbalists, and healers at the same time. They stood between the worlds, the visible and the invisible, and they gave people the feeling that they were not at the mercy of others. With the development of written cultures, science, and philosophy, medicine gained new forms. It became part of erudition, the art of diagnosis and healing, a discipline that systematically collected knowledge. But the history of medicine is not only a success story of progress. It is also a story of errors, of paths that led to dead ends, and of practices that we now perceive as cruel or naive. Leeches, cupping, bloodletting, magic formulas, and cures that did more harm than good, all this is just as much a part of it as the groundbreaking discoveries of antibiotics or vaccinations. Each epoch believed that it had found the right answer to illness, and each epoch was corrected by new insights. In addition, the history of medicine shows how closely it is linked to society, politics, religion, and culture. Epidemics changed the course of history. Think of the plague that shook Europe in the 14th century, or the smallpox that struck new continents with the colonial empires. Medical advances often went hand in hand with technical and scientific developments, as the example of bacteriology in the 19th century or radiology in the 20th century shows. At the same time, medicine has always been a field of ethical questions. Who may be treated, who may not? Which interventions are allowed, which are taboo? How much can people change on their own body? At its core, however, the history of medicine is a deeply human story. It tells of suffering and hope, of fear and trust, of the search for healing and the experience of finiteness. It makes it clear that health can never be taken for granted, but has always been endangered and embattled. In this struggle, man has not only increased his knowledge of the body over the millennia, but has also changed his image of man himself. The following illustration aims to trace this long journey, from the first healers in early cultures to the modern high-tech physicians of the present day. It is intended to show how medicine has developed as part of civilization, and how it has always sought new answers to the old questions of illness and healing. Because the history of medicine reflects nothing less than the history of mankind itself. Chapter 2. Medicine in Ancient Egypt, the art of healing between magic and practice. If we look at the history of medicine, there is hardly any way around Egypt. Hardly any other early advanced civilization has left such impressive testimonies of its medical knowledge. The Egyptians combined practical medicine with religious and magical ideas in a unique way. For them, illness was not only a physical condition, but always embedded in a larger cosmic and divine structure. The basis of Egyptian medicine lay in the close connection between religion, magic, and observation of nature. The gods played a central role. Thoth, the god of wisdom, was considered the guardian of the medical arts, while Isis, the great mother goddess, was worshipped as a healer. Illnesses were often interpreted as interference by evil spirits or as punishment from the gods. Healing, therefore, meant not only the treatment of the body, but also the restoration of divine order. The basis of Egyptian medicine lay in the close connection between religion, magic, and observation of nature. The gods played a central role. Thoth, the god of wisdom, was considered the guardian of the medical arts, while Isis, the great mother goddess, was worshipped as a healer. Illnesses were often interpreted as interference by evil spirits or as punishment from the gods. Healing, therefore, meant not only the treatment of the body, but also the restoration of divine order. Despite this spiritual interpretation, the Egyptians were remarkably practical. Archaeological finds and written sources, such as the Ebers Papyrus or the Edwin Smith Papyrus, provide a fascinating insight into their medical knowledge. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to around 1550 BC, contains over 800 recipes for various ailments, from eye inflammation to digestive problems to wound healing. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, even older, even shows the beginnings of rational surgery. It describes injuries, their symptoms, and possible treatments, almost like a modern medical report. Egyptian surgery is particularly impressive. Doctors called Sunu treated broken bones, put splints on, and stitched wounds. Trepanations, i.e. skull openings, are documented, as are dental treatments. The care of injuries caused by tools or weapons of war was also part of everyday life. Many of these practices are evidence of experience and close observation. The remedies came mainly from nature. Herbs such as garlic, onions, coriander, or myrrh were used as well as honey, which was surprisingly effective because of its antibacterial effect. Minerals, resins, and animal products were also used. Sometimes the recipes were rationally comprehensible. Sometimes they seemed more like magical symbols, such as the application of excrement or the mixing of substances whose benefit was doubtful. Magic was an integral part of Egyptian medicine anyway. Spells, amulets, and rituals accompanied almost every treatment. No matter how carefully the doctor applied an ointment, the healing was considered incomplete without the appropriate incantation. For the Egyptians, this was not a contradiction. Body and mind, nature and the supernatural were inseparably linked. Another aspect that makes Egyptian medicine unique is its connection to mummification. Through the centuries-long practice of embalming, the Egyptians acquired a deep knowledge of the human body. They knew organs such as the heart, lungs, liver, and kidneys, even if their functions were often misunderstood. For example, the heart was considered the seat of life and emotions, while the brain received little attention. It was even removed during mummification. Doctors were held in high esteem in ancient Egypt. They were often in the service of the pharaoh or large temples and specialized in certain parts of the body. There were dentists, ophthalmologists, and even abdominal doctors. Some enjoyed fame far beyond Egypt, such as Imhotep, who was revered and later even deified as a doctor, architect, and sage. Egyptian medicine was therefore a fascinating mixture. It was based on precise observation, practical healing methods, and natural history knowledge, but at the same time on rituals, worship of the gods, and magic. This connection shaped them for thousands of years, and many of their recipes and practices still had an impact on Greek and Roman medicine. Thus, in ancient Egypt, a basic pattern emerges that was to accompany the history of medicine for a long time. The tension between experience and faith, between empirical knowledge and spiritual interpretation. In this tension, an art of healing arose that was far ahead of its time and that still evokes awe today. Chapter 3: Mesopotamia and the Cradle of Healing. Even before Egypt experienced its heyday, the culture we know as Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, developed between the Euphrates and the Tigris. Not only did the first cities, scripts, and legal systems emerge here, but also the foundations of an art of healing, which in many ways paved the way for later cultures. The medicine of Mesopotamia was deeply embedded in a worldview in which gods, demons, and forces of fate determined the course of events. Nevertheless, the sources show that diseases were also viewed from a methodological point of view and practical solutions were sought. The most important source for our knowledge of Mesopotamian medicine are cuneiform tablets found in temple libraries such as that of Nineveh. They contain incantations, recipes, diagnoses, and observations. In particular, the so-called diagnostic collection, around 1000 BC, shows how detailed Mesopotamian physicians described symptoms. They noted skin changes, fever, breathing difficulties, and made prognoses about the chances of recovery or danger of death. The medical staff was divided into two parts. On the one hand, there were the asu, the healers, who worked with ointments, herbs, and surgical procedures. On the other hand, the ashipu, the conjurers, who interpreted illnesses as the work of evil spirits or divine punishments and sought healing with rituals and spells. Often the two worked hand in hand. One bandaged wounds while the other banished demonic forces. This combination shows how closely magic and practice were connected in Mesopotamian thought. The therapy consisted of a variety of remedies. Plants played a major role. Myrrh, thyme, coriander, or mustard were used as well as resins and oils. Minerals such as sulfur or salt were used for cleansing, while animal products, from milk fat to snakeskin, were part of some recipes. Many mixtures were applied to wounds, ingested or inhaled in smoke form. Surgical interventions are also documented. The famous laws of Hammurabi, 18th century BC, mention operations on the eye or the placement of bone splints. Interestingly, they also regulate the liability of the doctor. If an operation succeeds, he is rewarded. If it fails, he can be severely punished, in the worst case with the loss of his own hand. This strict regulation shows how seriously the medical profession was taken and how risky it was at the same time. Mesopotamian medicine was strongly influenced by religion. Illnesses were often interpreted as the result of sins or demonic influence. The causes were sought in divine wrath, curses, or evil omens. That is why divination, the interpretation of signs, played an important role. Observations of animals, stars, or dreams were used to explain the disease. Nevertheless, there is also an astonishing accuracy in the symptoms here, which is reminiscent of an early form of medical diagnosis. A particularly impressive aspect is the close connection between medicine and astronomy. Since the stars were understood as an expression of divine order, it was believed that they also determined health and illness. The physician was therefore not only a healer, but at the same time an interpreter of the signs of heaven. The position of doctors in Mesopotamia was ambivalent. On the one hand, they enjoyed prestige because they acted as mediators between humans and gods. On the other hand, their success was uncertain, and the strict legal system put them under great pressure. Nevertheless, they were indispensable, especially in the big cities where injuries, infections, and epidemics were part of everyday life. The Mesopotamian art of healing had a lasting influence on later cultures. Many of their recipes and ideas were adopted by the Babylonians and Assyrians and passed on through cultural contact. Their dual system, practical medicine on the one hand, ritual healing on the other, was a model that also left its mark in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. So it can be said that Mesopotamia not only gave rise to writing and the law, but also an early form of medicine that was already amazingly differentiated. It shows man in his double role, as a physical being who wants to alleviate pain, and as a spiritual being who always sees illness as a sign of higher powers. Chapter 4, India and Ayurveda, Holistic Medicine in Antiquity. While in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the art of healing formed a close connection between magic and practice, a system developed in India that is still of great importance today: Ayurveda. This knowledge of life, as the name is translated, originated more than 2,500 years ago and combined observation, philosophy, and religion into a holistic approach that understood man not only as a body, but as part of a larger cosmic whole. The roots of Ayurveda lie in the Vedas, the holy scriptures of Hinduism, which originated between 1500 and 500 BC. The Atharva Veda in particular contains numerous references to healing methods, herbal recipes, and rituals. But from the very beginning, Ayurveda was more than a collection of recipes. It was a comprehensive system that understood health as a balance between body and mind, man and nature, the inner forces, and the cosmic laws. At the center of this teaching are the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. They represent basic life energies or functional principles. Vata stands for movement and air, Pitta for metabolism and fire, Kapha for structure and water. According to Ayurvedic ideas, illness arose when these forces were out of balance. The doctor's task was therefore not only to treat symptoms, but to restore balance through diet, lifestyle, remedies, and mental discipline. The classic texts of Ayurveda, the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, were written between about 600 BC and 500 AD. They are vast compendiums of medical knowledge, containing hundreds of prescriptions, therapies, and diagnoses. The Charaka Samhita particularly emphasizes internal medicine, the role of nutrition, the importance of dietetics and lifestyle. The Sushruta Samhita, on the other hand, is considered a work of surgery. It describes over 300 surgical procedures, 120 instruments, and even plastic surgeries, such as the reconstruction of noses, an indication of how advanced Indian surgery was. Ayurveda was strongly influenced by philosophy. Man was not considered an isolated being, but a mirror of the universe. Body, soul, and spirit formed a unity, and healing always meant spiritual cleansing. Meditation, yoga, and breathing exercises were therefore part of the therapy, an approach that is gaining popularity again today in a modern form. The remedies of Ayurveda are mainly based on plants. Thousands of herbs, roots, and seeds have been systematically described and used. Ginger to promote digestion, turmeric as an anti-inflammatory, neem as an antibacterial substance. Minerals and animal products were also used. Individual adaptation was crucial. Each patient was treated according to their constitutional type, and therapy plans were tailored to personal balance. The doctors in ancient India, the Vaidyas, had an important position. They underwent a long education that included not only medical knowledge, but also moral and spiritual training. A good doctor should not only know remedies, but also possess compassion, patience, and wisdom. Medical ethics was a central component of Ayurveda. Healing should serve the well-being of the person, not the fame or fortune of the doctor. In India, too, medicine was closely linked to religion. Illnesses were sometimes thought to be the result of karma or divine influences, but at the same time, people were seen as responsible for their health. A proper lifestyle, moderate nutrition, cleanliness, harmony with nature was crucial to preventing disease. Ayurveda was not limited to India. Its ideas reached Central Asia, the Arab world, and even Europe via trade routes, where they were received in a modified form. Today, Ayurveda is experiencing a worldwide renaissance, not only as an alternative medicine, but also as an inspiration from modern concepts of prevention and holistic therapy. Indian medicine impressively shows that the art of healing is always an expression of a culture. While the Egyptians relied on magical practical recipes and the Greeks developed rational observation, India combined medicine with philosophy and spirituality. Ayurveda is still a living testament to this connection, a system that understands the human being not only as a body, but as part of the cosmos. Chapter 5. Medicine in Ancient China, from acupuncture to herbal medicine. While Ayurveda originated in India, an equally comprehensive but completely independent system developed in China, traditional Chinese medicine. Its roots go back more than 2.5 millennia, and its basic principles continue to shape healing methods in Asia and increasingly in the Western world. The focus is on the idea of harmony and balance between man and nature, body and mind, yin and yang. Chinese medicine arose from a worldview that saw the universe as a network of forces and relationships. In this understanding, illness was not a random disorder, but an expression of an imbalance in the interplay of cosmic energies. Two concepts were decisive: yin and yang, as well as qi. Yin and yang symbolize the opposites that complement each other: cold and warmth, rest and movement, darkness and light. Qi, in turn, was the life energy that flowed through the body and circulated in pathways, the so-called meridians. The oldest fundamental work of Chinese medicine is the Huangdi Neijing, the inner classic of the Yellow Emperor, probably created between the 3rd and 1st centuries BC. In this monumental text, diagnosis, therapy, and lifestyle are described in a philosophical framework. The doctor is understood not only as a healer, but also as a guardian of harmony. One of the best-known methods that emerged from this tradition is acupuncture. By placing fine needles at certain points on the meridians, the qi was to be brought back into flow and blockages released. Even in ancient China, bronze or gold needles were used for this therapy, which was used to treat pain, internal illnesses, and psychological complaints. Acupuncture was not just a technique, but an expression of the idea that healing means restoring balance. In addition to acupuncture, herbal medicine played a central role. Chinese healers described hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products. Ginseng was considered a tonic, ginger as a digestive agent, ma huang, ephedra, as a remedy for respiratory diseases. These substances were combined in complex formulations that were tailored to the individual constitution of the patient. The diagnostic methods also showed a special understanding of the body. Doctors paid attention to pulse diagnosis, tongue texture, skin color, and odors. Pulse diagnosis in particular achieved a high level of art. More than 20 different types of pulses were distinguished, which were supposed to provide conclusions about internal states. For the Chinese doctor, the body was like a landscape that could be read by careful observation. Another important area was prevention. Chinese medicine emphasized the importance of a balanced lifestyle that included diet, exercise, and mental balance. Qigong exercises, meditation, and breathing techniques were recommended to strengthen the qi and prevent diseases. Chinese medicine thus combined healing with prevention at an early stage, an idea that has often only been rediscovered with difficulty in modern health systems. The position of the doctor in China was ambivalent. On the one hand, he was considered a scholar and knower who was deeply instructed in philosophy and natural history. On the other hand, he was measured by his practical success. An old tradition says that particularly good doctors were paid as long as their patients remained healthy. If they fell ill, it was considered a failure of the doctor. This too shows the strong emphasis on prevention. As in other early cultures, medicine in China was closely linked to religion and cosmology. But unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, the focus was less on the gods and more on the order of nature. Healing meant rejoining the rhythm of heaven and earth. This view gave Chinese medicine a philosophical depth that makes it unmistakable to this day. Ancient Chinese medicine was not a rigid system, but a living tradition that developed over thousands of years. Her basic principles, qi, yin, and yang, the importance of harmony and lifestyle, still shape her today. While Western medicine often targets specific causes and interventions, Chinese medicine pursues the approach of looking at the whole person. It thus exemplifies a different way of understanding healing, not as a fight against illness, but as a restoration of balance. Chapter 6: Medicine in Ancient Greece, Hippocrates and the Birth of Rational Healing. With the Greeks, medicine entered a new phase in its history. While in Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, magic, religion, and philosophy had shaped the art of healing, in Greece, a medicine developed that for the first time looked at the human being systematically and rationally. She searched for natural causes of diseases and focused on observation. This attitude made Greek medicine a decisive turning point and one of the roots of modern medicine. The best-known symbol of this new direction is Hippocrates of Kos, c. 460–370 BC, who is often referred to as the father of medicine. Even though much of what has been handed down under his name probably comes from his students, the so-called Hippocratic collection of writings is considered the cornerstone of a new art of healing. It contains over 60 texts that deal with diagnoses, prognosis, therapies, and medical ethics. At the heart of Hippocratic medicine was the idea that diseases are not caused by gods or demons, but have natural causes. Fever, wounds, or epidemics were not punishments from the gods, but processes in the body that could be understood and influenced. In doing so, Hippocrates demystified the disease and made it a phenomenon accessible to human reason. A central concept was the four juices doctrine. The human body, the Greeks believed, consisted of four basic substances: blood, mucus, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant a balance of these juices. Illness arose from their imbalance. Even if this theory was wrong by today's standards, it shaped European medicine for many centuries. Therapies such as bloodletting, diet, or laxatives are aimed at restoring balance. Particularly important was the close observation of the patient. Hippocrates emphasized that the doctor must not only see the disease, but the whole person: his way of life, his environment, his diet, even the climate. This holistic view was a great innovation. The doctor became an attentive observer who described symptoms in detail and derived prognoses from them. In the Hippocratic writings, there are impressive medical histories that seem almost like modern case reports. In addition to theory, practice also played an important role. Greek doctors treated wounds, swellings, broken bones, and internal ailments. They used simple surgical instruments such as knives, forceps, or drills, and performed procedures that caused astonishment, from trepanating the skull to treating joint dislocations. At the same time, they recommended diets, exercise, baths, and massages, measures that served not only healing but also prevention. A special merit of the Greeks was medical ethics. The famous Hippocratic Oath, even if it was not taken in its original form by all doctors, formulated principles that are still valid today: to respect the well-being of the patient, to keep secrets, to avoid harm. Here, the doctor was understood not only as a technician, but as a moral authority. Medicine was closely linked to philosophy in Greece. Physicians such as Hippocrates or later Galen saw their work in harmony with the great thinkers. Philosophers such as Aristotle were interested in anatomy and physiology, while Plato reflected on the relationship between body and soul in his dialogues. Medicine thus became part of a larger intellectual project to explain the world through reason. In addition to Hippocrates, there were other important physicians. Alcmaeon of Croton, for example, recognized the importance of the brain for sensory perception as early as the 5th century BC. In the 3rd century BC, Herophilus of Alexandria examined the nervous system by dissecting corpses, thus laying the foundation for anatomy. These achievements showed that the Greeks were willing to transcend taboos in order to gain knowledge. Greek medicine had a lasting effect. Through the conquests of Alexander the Great, their ideas spread as far as India and Egypt. Later, the Romans took it up and made it the foundation of their own art of healing. Even in the Middle Ages, the Hippocratic writings were considered authoritative, and the doctrine of the four humors remained valid until the early modern period. Thus, Greek medicine marked the beginning of a new epoch. It separated illness from divine punishment, placed observation above ritual, and established medical ethics. Even though many of her theories are outdated, her spirit remains alive, claiming to heal people with reason and compassion. Chapter 7. Rome and Galen. Medicine between pragmatism and theory. While the Greeks laid the foundations of rational medicine, the Romans were masters of organization and pragmatism. Their medicine was shaped less by philosophical speculation than by practical necessities. In an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, doctors were needed for soldiers, slaves, civil servants, and citizens. A medicine that had to consist not only of thought, but above all of action. The Romans took over a lot from the Greeks. Hippocrates' writings and the doctrine of the four humors were also authoritative in Rome. Many doctors in the empire were even Greeks who came to Rome as slaves, freedmen, or scholars. But the Romans shaped medicine in their own way. They combined theory with a strong emphasis on hygiene, care, and organization. Public health in particular was a Roman achievement. With their aqueducts, sewage systems, public baths, and latrines, they created an infrastructure that went far beyond what was common in other cultures. Clean water, regular personal hygiene, and municipal waste disposal improved living conditions considerably, even if the Romans themselves did not always explain these measures with disease prevention, but with order, culture, and prosperity. Roman military medicine was another field in which they excelled. Each legion had its own doctors and medical facilities. There were military hospitals, valetudinaria, where the wounded were treated, and precise regulations for hygiene in camps. Injuries from battles, cuts, broken bones, arrow and spear wounds were routinely treated. This practical handling of injuries made Roman medicine a tool of military strength. Among the physicians of Rome, one figure stands out in particular, Galen of Pergamum, 129 to circa 200 AD. He was Greek by birth, but worked for a long time in Rome and became the personal physician of several emperors. Galen combined the tradition of the Greeks with his own research. He dissects animals, studied their anatomy, and transferred the results to humans. Although this led to errors, for example with regard to the circulatory system, his writings formed a monumental doctrinal edifice that determined medical thinking in Europe for 1,000 years. Galen was not only a doctor, but also a philosopher. He wrote about anatomy, physiology, dietetics, pharmacology, and ethics. His theories of blood flow, the nervous system, and the functions of the organs shaped generations. In particular, his emphasis on the doctrine of juices strengthened their dominance. Galen saw the physician as a scientist, theoretician, and practitioner at the same time, an image that determined the ideal of the scholarly physician until the Renaissance. But Rome knew not only the great scholars, but also the general practitioners of everyday life. In the cities, there were baths that extracted teeth, treated wounds, or performed simple operations. Pharmacists traded in herbs, ointments, and minerals. Home remedies were also widespread, and many families knew recipes for fever, cough, or stomach problems. The Romans particularly valued dietetics, that is, the art of leading a correct lifestyle. Diet, exercise, baths, and sleep were considered crucial for health. Roman medicine, for example, combined healing with a lifestyle that emphasized moderation and order in keeping with Roman culture. Despite all its achievements, Roman medicine also remained in many ways within the limits of its time. She knew neither the causes of infections nor the functioning of the circulation. Many therapies continued to consist of bloodletting, emetics, or leeches. But its strength lay in practical organization and systemization, a strength that formed the foundation for medieval medicine. Thus, Roman medicine was a link. It preserved the Greek heritage, added pragmatic elements, and created an authority in Galen that lasted for centuries. Between theory and practice, between philosophy and the military, between hygiene and surgery, Rome formed an art of healing that remained effective long after the fall of the empire. Chapter 8. Medicine in the Early Middle Ages. Monasteries, Monastery Gardens, and Medicine. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the ancient medical tradition in the West also largely collapsed. Cities fell into disrepair, schools disappeared, and much knowledge was lost. But medicine did not die out completely. It found new homes in monasteries, in the Christian church, and in the hands of simple healers. The early Middle Ages were a time in which ancient knowledge, folk medicine, and religious ideas were combined. The monasteries in particular became centers of medicine. Benedictines, Augustinians, and other orders saw it as part of their ministry to care for the sick and help the poor. Hospitals were built in the monasteries, which were open not only to monks but also to pilgrims and the needy. These institutions were not so much places of healing in the modern sense, but places of care. The sick were to find relief and spiritual comfort here. The monastery gardens played a central role. There, the monks cultivated medicinal plants that they knew from the writings of antiquity or used through their own observation. Mint, Sage, valerian, fennel, and many other herbs were grown, dried, and processed into ointments, teas, or powders. Charlemagne's famous Capitulari de Villis around 800 even prescribed which medicinal plants should be grown in the royal gardens, an indication of the importance of herbal medicine at that time. Important sources of knowledge were the writings of ancient authors, which were copied and preserved in the monasteries. In particular, Dioscorides' De Materia Medica and the writings of Galen remained in circulation. But many texts have been shortened, simplified, or mixed with Christian ideas. Illness was often considered the result of sin, and healing also meant spiritual cleansing through confession and prayer. In addition to monastic medicine, there was folk medicine, which was practiced by midwives, bathers, herbalists, and itinerant healers. It combined ancient traditions with magical elements. Amulets, blessings, and rituals accompanied the use of herbs or simple surgical procedures. This form of medicine was widespread in everyday life, even if the Church sometimes eyed it with suspicion. The physicians of the early Middle Ages had a lower reputation than their ancient predecessors. The medical profession was not systematically organized, and there were no fixed schools. Those who healed often did so on the basis of experience, traditional recipes, and religious knowledge. Nevertheless, regional centers were established in which medicine was cultivated. For example, in Ireland, where monks preserved ancient knowledge, or in monasteries such as Monte Cassino in Italy. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1079, played a special role, even though she already belongs to the High Middle Ages. Her natural history and medical writings combined herbal medicine with mystical insights and exemplify how strongly religion and medicine were interwoven at that time. In the early Middle Ages, therefore, medicine was less a scientific discipline than a part of religious and practical life. It served to care, and maintain everyday life. But it was in the monasteries that the foundations for a later renewal were laid. Ancient knowledge survived here, plants were systematically cultivated here, and the first hospitals in Europe were built here. Thus, the early Middle Ages show themselves not only as an epoch of loss, but also as a time of preservation. Between prayer and gardening, between psalms and ointments, a medicine arose that was simple but true to life and which formed the foundation for the rediscovery of ancient science in the centuries to come. Chapter 9. Arabic Medicine, Translations, Innovations, and Avicenna. While in Europe, the medical knowledge of antiquity survived only fragmentarily in the monasteries, in the Arab Islamic world, it flourished in a hitherto unknown way. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, Arabic medicine became the center of the art of healing, and its writings shaped both the Orient and the West for centuries. Here, ancient heritage, Indian and Persian influences, as well as new observations, combined to form a huge fund of knowledge. A decisive step was the translation movement. In Baghdad, the cultural center of the Abbasid Empire, the famous House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, was built in the 9th century. Here, Greek, Syriac, and Persian texts were translated into Arabic. Writings by Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides were thus made accessible to the Arab world and at the same time saved from oblivion. Later, these texts came back to Europe via Spain and Sicily, often in the Arabic version. But Arab medicine was not limited to the preservation of the old. She developed new concepts, improved diagnoses and therapies, and attached great importance to systematic knowledge. An outstanding example is Avicenna, Ibn Sina, 980 to 1337, whose work Al-Qanun fit Tibb, Canon of Medicine, became the standard textbook of medicine. It summarized the knowledge of its time, combined Greek tradition with its own observations, and remained decisive in Europe until the 17th century. Avicenna described hundreds of diseases, therapies, and cures. He differentiated between infectious diseases, described infection through water and earth, and attached importance to hygiene and prevention. His presentation of pulse diagnosis, which he systematized and refined, became particularly famous. His emphasis on dietetics and mental health also shows how holistic his approach was. Another important physician was Rhazes, al-Razi, 865 to 925, who wrote an extensive medical work. He was the first to systematically describe measles and smallpox, clearly distinguishing these diseases from each other and emphasizing the importance of observation and experience. Rhazes was a sharp critic of dogmatic medicine and demanded that doctors should not blindly follow scriptures but must learn through their own experience. Surgery and pharmacy also developed strongly. The Andalusian physician Al-Bukhasis al-Zaharwi, ca. 936 to 1013, wrote a monumental work on surgical techniques that included illustrations. He described operations for hernias, dental problems, and birth complications, and is considered the father of modern surgery. The Arab world was also pioneering in pharmacy. Pharmacies, cydalas, emerged as separate institutions, and the production of medicines was systematically organized. Distillation, filtration, and other chemical processes were developed to obtain remedies. This gave rise to a pharmaceutical science that went far beyond what antiquity knew. Arab medicine was also strongly influenced by ethics. Doctors should be distinguished by education, experience, and moral responsibility. Works such as the Medical Ethics by Ishaq ibn Ali al-Ruhawi emphasize that the doctor must be both a scholar and a virtuous person, an attitude reminiscent of the Hippocratic Oath. This knowledge reached Europe via Spain, especially Toledo and Córdoba. Translators such as Gerhard of Cremona translated the works into Latin, and so Arabic medicine became the basis of teaching at the first European universities. Without Avicenna, Rhazes, and Al-Bukhasis, the medicine of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance would not have been conceivable. In this way, Arabic medicine shows how fruitful the exchange between cultures can be. It not only preserved ancient knowledge, but also continued it, supplemented it with new discoveries, and created a bridge between antiquity and modernity. At a time when Europe was still stuck in religious narrowness and political fragmentation, the Arab world was the laboratory of medicine, and its legacy continues to have an impact today. Chapter 10: Europe in the High Middle Ages, Universities, Scholasticism, and the Rediscovery of Antiquity. With the High Middle Ages, from about the 12th century onwards, an epoch of intellectual and cultural renewal began in Europe. Cities grew, trade flourished, and with the first universities, centers of knowledge emerged that laid the foundations for systematic training in many disciplines, including medicine. During this time, ancient and Arabic knowledge was rediscovered and placed in a European system known as scholasticism. Medicine in the High Middle Ages was closely linked to the universities. Places such as Bologna, Paris, Montpellier, and Salerno became strongholds of medical teaching. In particular, the School of Salerno is considered the first medical center in Europe. Here, the heritage of antiquity was combined with the knowledge of the Arabs and with practical experience. The famous Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, an instructional poem on healthy living, was distributed throughout Europe and served as a guide for generations. The universities structured the training of doctors. First, they studied the artes liberalis, grammar, logic, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, music, and geometry, before moving on to the higher faculties such as theology, law, or medicine. In medicine, the study of the scriptures was in the foreground. Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and Rhazes were the authorities whose works were commented on and discussed. This scholastic method consisted of clarifying apparent contradictions between the texts and creating a harmonious system. The physician of the High Middle Ages was less a researcher than a scholar, who interpreted traditional knowledge. Nevertheless, this study was crucial because it put medicine on an academic basis and elevated it beyond mere experience. However, the practice has not been forgotten. Doctors examined patients, observed symptoms, and tried to apply therapies. Bloodletting, cupping, and the administration of herbal remedies remained central methods, always with the aim of restoring the balance of the juices. Dietetics, i.e., the art of proper nutrition and lifestyle, played a major role. The doctor was also an advisor for daily life. Exercise, sleep, nutrition, and mental balance were considered crucial for health. In addition to the university doctors, there were numerous other healers. Bathers who performed simple surgical procedures, midwives who accompanied births, itinerant doctors and herbalists who worked in folk medicine. The relationship between these groups was often tense. Academic doctors accused the laity of bungling, while the people often distrusted university doctors because their treatments were complicated and expensive. The church also continued to play a major role. On the one hand, it promoted medical education by supporting monasteries and universities. On the other hand, it set limits. Dissections on human corpses were controversial for a long time because they were considered an intervention in divine creation. Nevertheless, it was precisely at this time that the first systematic anatomical studies were carried out. For example, in Bologna, where post-mortem examinations were held for students. The plague waves of the 14th century in particular posed enormous challenges for medicine. Doctors tried to explain the causes of the disease, sometimes by miasms, i.e. bad air, sometimes by astrological influences. Although the explanations were often wrong, the confrontation with the epidemic led to an intensification of medical research and a greater demand for doctors. So the High Middle Ages were a transitional period. It was marked by a return to antiquity through Arab mediation, by the establishment of solid institutions, and by a new erudition that placed medicine within the framework of science. Even though much was still under the spell of scholasticism and experiments were rare, this epoch laid the foundation for the great advances of the Renaissance. The medicine of the High Middle Ages shows how much knowledge and society are connected. It was no longer just a matter for monasteries and folk healers, but part of an academic culture that produced doctors who saw themselves as scholars and experts. This finally made medicine a discipline in its own right and paved the way for the next Great Awakening. Chapter 11. Plague and Epidemics, Medical Challenges in the Late Middle Ages. Hardly any other event has had such a profound impact on the history of medicine and Europe as the great epidemics of the late Middle Ages, above all the plague. It not only put the medical knowledge of the time to the test, but also changed the social fabric, religious thinking, and the self-image of the art of healing. Diseases were no longer just individual fates, they became collective catastrophes that affected millions of people and depopulated entire regions. The plague, also known as the Black Death, reached Europe in the middle of the 14th century. It spread rapidly along the trade routes, claiming an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1352. Contemporary reports describe the horror: swollen bumps in the armpits and groin, fever, vomiting, black spots on the skin, and a quick death within a few days. Panic, despair, and hopelessness took hold. For the medicine of that time, the plague was an almost insoluble challenge. The prevailing doctrine of the four humors could hardly explain the sudden and mass occurrence of the disease. Many doctors interpreted it as the result of miasmas, i.e. toxic fumes in the air caused by conjunctions of the planets, earthquakes, or swamps. Others saw the plague as God's punishment for the sins of mankind. These interpretations led to very different reactions, from medical treatment attempts to penitential processions and religious fanaticism. The therapies were correspondingly helpless. Bloodletting, cupping, herbal mixtures, and incense were used, as were amulets and prayers. Some doctors recommended certain diets or staying in clean air. Quarantine measures were first introduced in Italy, where ships in Venice had to lie in port for 40 days before their crews were allowed to go ashore, a forerunner of modern disease control measures. But the plague was not the only plague of the late Middle Ages. Leprosy was also widespread. Lepers were isolated in leprosariums, often on the outskirts of the cities. The disease was not only considered a medical problem, but also a social and religious problem. Leprosy was associated with sin, impurity, and exclusion, and the sick often lived under the stigma of exclusion. Also feared were famines and epidemics such as typhus or dysentery, which afflicted entire regions in times of poor harvests and wars. Since medicine offered only limited explanations and therapies, religious interpretations played a major role. Flagellants, flagellating themselves, roamed Europe to appease divine wrath. At the same time, there was violence against minorities, such as Jews, who were falsely accused of poisoning wells. The experience of the plague left deep marks. It shook confidence in medicine, but also in church and society. At the same time, it led to new considerations in dealing with illness. Cities developed health departments, the first hygienic measures were introduced, and awareness of infection grew. Even if the true causes were not known, the plague was transmitted by the flea of the rat. These approaches laid the foundation for later progress in disease control. For the doctors, the epidemics posed a challenge that changed their role. Some fled the disease like other people. Others stayed and cared for the sick, even if they often died themselves. The reputation of medicine suffered because its means failed. At the same time, a new image of the doctor emerged, as someone who not only heals, but also manages and organizes protective measures. The epidemics of the late Middle Ages show how closely medicine was intertwined with society, religion, and politics. They reveal the limits of the knowledge of the time, but also the ability to react to disasters and create new structures. In the midst of the horror, the first steps towards public health care were taken, which would later be expanded in modern times. Thus, plague and other epidemics were not only medical disasters, but also catalysts of change. They made it clear that health is not only an individual, but a collective task, a finding that has lost none of its relevance to our present day. Chapter 12: Renaissance and Humanism, Paracelsus and the Anatomy of the New Age. The Renaissance marked the beginning of an era of profound changes for medicine. The rediscovery of antiquity, the focus on people as individuals, and the development of new scientific methods brought about a dynamic that also affected the art of healing. Medicine was no longer understood only as the preservation and interpretation of traditional texts, but increasingly as a field of one's own observation and research. This marked the beginning of the transition to modern medicine. A central element of this development was humanism. Scholars called for a return to the sources, ad fontes. Instead of studying Galen and Avicenna only through commentaries and translations, the original texts were used and critically examined. This attitude led to the fact that old authorities were valued but no longer untouchable. The doctor was allowed, indeed had to, make his own experiences and study nature himself. Anatomy became a central science during this time. In cities such as Padua or Bologna, public sections were held in which corpses were examined in front of students and scholars. This was a huge step because for a long time, the dissection of human bodies had been subject to religious reservations. Now, however, the human body became the book of nature that had to be read. Andreas Vesal, 1514 to 1564, in particular revolutionized anatomy. His work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, is considered a milestone. With detailed descriptions and masterful woodcuts, Vesal showed the actual structure of the body and proved many of Galen's mistakes who had relied on animal dissections. Vesal placed direct observation above the authority of ancient writings and thus founded modern anatomy. However, the Renaissance brought not only advances in anatomy, but also new approaches in pharmacology and medical philosophy. Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, the Swiss physician and alchemist, questioned many things that had been considered irrefutable until then. He criticized the doctrine of the four humors and scholastic medicine and instead emphasized the importance of chemistry. Diseases, according to Paracelsus, are not imbalances of the juices, but specific processes that require specific remedies. The dose makes the poison. One of his most famous sentences sums up his teaching. Substances can heal or harm depending on the amount and application. Paracelsus was an uncomfortable spirit. He publicly burned the writings of Galen and Avicenna and relied on experience instead of authority. His medicine was based on minerals, metals, and chemical substances, which he used in a targeted manner. Even if not all of his ideas were true, he opened medicine to new methods and broke with old dogmas. This made him a forerunner of modern pharmacology and toxicology. The Renaissance was also a time of growing networking. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg around 1450, enabled the rapid dissemination of medical texts, illustrations, and findings. Works like Vassals reached a large audience and accelerated the exchange of knowledge. Doctors and scholars corresponded throughout Europe and formed a network that promoted progress. The role of the doctor also changed. He was no longer just an interpreter of old texts or a practitioner, but increasingly a researcher. At the same time, the doctor became more of a part of public life, at princely courts, in cities, in universities. Medicine was no longer just monastic or university knowledge, but part of the cultural flowering of the Renaissance. The Renaissance and humanism thus marked a turning point. They freed medicine from old shackles, opened it up to observation, experimentation, and criticism, and led to groundbreaking discoveries in anatomy, pharmacology, and medicine. Paracelsus and Vassal stand as symbolic figures for this era, one as a radical innovator, the other as a precise anatomist. Together, they showed that medicine must not remain in the past, but must constantly renew itself, a finding that is still valid today. Chapter 13. Modern Medical Revolutions. Vassal, Harvey, and the Anatomy of the Body. The modern era brought about a whole series of medical revolutions that fundamentally changed the understanding of the human body and its functions. While the Renaissance had opened the doors to observation, modern times continued this observation with systematic research, experiments, and new methods. Anatomy and physiology, which had long been determined by speculation, now became exact sciences. As already mentioned, a decisive step was the work of Andreas Vassal, 1514–1564. With his Fabrica, he depicted the first comprehensively correct image of the human body. He corrected many of Galen's errors, such as the idea that the sternum consists of 7 parts or that the blood flows through invisible pores in the heart septum. Vassal showed that only the direct examination of the body provides reliable knowledge. In doing so, he laid the foundation for modern anatomy, a revolution that made the body the object of scientific curiosity. But anatomy alone could not explain how the body functioned. William Harvey, 1578–1567, came on the scene here. With his work Exercitatio Anatomica de Motu Cordis et Sanguinis in Animalibus, 1628, he was the first to correctly describe the blood circulation. He showed through experiments that the heart is a pump that moves blood through arteries and veins in circulation, an idea that completely disproved Galen's theory of the consumability of blood. Harvey's discovery was a sensation. It combined precise observation with experimental method and became a milestone in physiology. At the same time, other areas of medicine developed. Microscopy opened up new worlds. With the work of Robert Hooke, 1635–1703, and Antony van Leeuwenhoek, cells, bacteria, and capillaries became visible. For the first time, you could see structures that had previously remained invisible. This led to new hypotheses about the structure and function of the body, even though the germ theory was not developed until later. The modern era also brought an expansion of pharmacological knowledge. In addition to the medicinal plants that had been used for centuries, new substances appeared that came to Europe through trade and colonization. Globalization also opened up new horizons for medicine. Equally important was the change in the scientific method. Medicine became part of the so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century. Observation, experiment, and mathematical description became the ideal. Doctors and naturalists worked hand in hand to fathom the natural laws of the body. The doctor was no longer just a scholar or practitioner, but a researcher in the service of truth. Medical training also changed. Universities set up anatomical theaters where students dissected corpses. Surgery and internal medicine were taught more systematically. At the same time, the gap between academic doctors and folk healers grew, who continued to use herbs, amulets, and magical practices. The modern era thus brought a double revolution. It created a new image of the body as a functioning system, mechanical, explorable, explainable, and it established a method that was not based on authority but on experience and experiment. Vissal and Harvey exemplify this change, one as the founder of modern anatomy, the other as the discoverer of the bloodstream. Together, they led medicine on the path to science in the modern sense. But these revolutions also had limits. Many diseases remained poorly understood, and therapies often continued to be characterized by bloodletting and laxatives. Although the human body was described better and better, the causes of infections or cancer remained in the dark. It was not until the 19th century that bacteriology was to take another decisive step. Nevertheless, the modern era marked the beginning of a new medicine. She freed herself from dogmas, relied on research, and created the foundations on which the modern art of healing is still built today. Chapter 14. Medicine in the Age of Enlightenment: Science, Experiment, and Progress. The 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, brought a new spiritual attitude to medicine. Reason, criticism, and systematic research were in the foreground, and the doctors of this time increasingly saw themselves as scientists who could uncover the natural laws of the body through observation and experiment. Medicine moved further and further away from speculation and dogmas and approached an empirically based science. The Enlightenment was characterized by a belief in progress and education. Universities, academies, and scientific societies flourished. Doctors discussed in learned circles, published treatises, and exchanged knowledge throughout Europe. Medicine became part of the movement that permeated the entire society. Everything was to be rationally justified and reviewed. An important field was anatomy. Public dissections and anatomical theaters became centers of teaching. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci had already contributed to the specification of the body image through their drawings, but now anatomical knowledge was expanded even more systematically. Physiology also developed. Breathing, digestion, nerve functions, and muscle activity were investigated with increasingly sophisticated experiments. Electricity in particular fascinated the doctors of the Enlightenment. Experiments with frogs' legs led to the discovery of animal electricity by Luigi Galvani, which later inspired Alessandro Volta to develop the battery. This research was not only important for physics, but also raised medical hopes, for example, for the cure of paralysis or nervous diseases. Surgery also experienced progress. Although there was no anesthesia or antiseptic methods yet, surgical techniques were improved. Surgeons such as Pierre-Joseph Dassault laid the foundations of modern orthopedic surgery. At the same time, surgery began to be more closely linked to academic medicine. Until then, it had often been left to bathers and craftsmen, but now it gained scientific prestige. Another important advance was the birth of epidemiology and social medicine. Doctors began to systematically collect data on diseases and mortality. William Petty and John Grant in England evaluated death registers and thus laid the basis for the demography and statistical analysis of health. It was increasingly recognized that illnesses were not only individual fates, but also had social causes and consequences. The development of smallpox vaccination was particularly significant. For a long time, variolation had been known in Asia and the Ottoman Empire. The deliberate infection with attenuated smallpox viruses, which was supposed to cause a milder course of the disease and immunity. In the 18th century, this practice found its way to Europe. It was risky, but it saved many lives and paved the way for Edward Jenner's groundbreaking discovery of the cowpox vaccine at the end of the century. This was the beginning of the history of modern immunology. Psychiatry also took its first steps. Until then, mental illness was often considered a demonic possession or moral failure. In the Enlightenment, the idea that mental illnesses could be treated medically slowly prevailed. Doctors such as Philippe Pinel pleaded for a more humane approach to the mentally ill by having the chains loosened in the Parisian asylums. This was the beginning of the long development of modern psychiatry. Medical ethics also underwent a new imprint. Enlightenment meant taking responsibility for humans as rational beings. Doctors should not only heal, but also educate, promote hygienic measures, and inform the population about health. This meant that medicine was placed more in the service of the general public. The Age of Enlightenment was thus a time of transition. Old traditions such as bloodletting persisted. But at the same time, new methods emerged that relied on observation, statistics, and experimentation. Medicine began to take place not only at the bedside, but also in laboratories, lecture halls, and societies. The Enlightenment made medicine a science in the modern sense, critical, rational, and committed to progress. She led them out of the shadow of scholasticism and placed them on the foundation of reason and experience. This paved the way for the great discoveries of the 19th century, which were to finally lead the art of healing into the modern age. Chapter 15. The 19th Century, Bacteriology, Vaccinations, and the Birth of Modern Medicine. The 19th century is considered the epoch in which medicine finally took the step into the modern age. While earlier centuries had mainly produced observation, anatomy, and experimental approaches, the combination of microbiology, chemistry, and clinical practice now led to a revolution in medical thinking. Diseases were no longer understood as vague imbalances or miasmas, but as concrete processes with specific causes. One key to this was the emergence of bacteriology. With the invention and improvement of the microscope, doctors and natural scientists were able to make the invisible world of microorganisms visible. Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, showed in his famous experiments that microbes are responsible for fermentation and putrefaction. In doing so, he refuted the theory of spontaneous procreation and laid the foundation for the germ theory of diseases. Pasteur also developed vaccines against rabies, anthrax, and poultry cholera, a triumph of prevention that fundamentally changed medicine. At the same time, Robert Koch, 1843 to 1910, worked in Germany. He developed methods to isolate and cultivate bacteria and identified the causative agents of anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Koch's postulates, the criteria according to which a microorganism is considered the cause of disease, became the methodological foundation of modern infection medicine. His work made it clear that specific diseases have specific causes, an insight that revolutionized all medical thinking. Advances in bacteriology also led to a revolution in surgery. Joseph Lister, 1827 to 1912, transferred Pasteur's ideas to wound treatment and introduced antiseptic methods. He used carbolic acid to disinfect instruments, hands, and surgical wounds, and thus drastically reduced mortality during operations. Antisepsis was the first step towards modern aseptic surgery, which was later perfected by sterile instruments and surgical clothing. Another milestone was the development of anesthesia. Until the 19th century, operations were an ordeal for patients. They had to be endured in full consciousness and in unimaginable pain. With the introduction of ether, 1846, and chloroform, 1847, patients could be operated on pain-free for the first time. This opened up a completely new field of surgery. Complicated procedures that had previously been unthinkable were now possible. Vaccinations also continued to develop. Edward Jenner's groundbreaking discovery of cowpox vaccination in 1796 was widely used in the 19th century. States organized vaccination campaigns, and smallpox control became an early example of public health care. The success of the vaccinations showed that medicine could not only work at the bedside, but also at the social level. The clinic as an institution gained enormous importance in the 19th century. Hospitals, which had previously often been considered places of misery, now became centers of medical research and education. Physicians such as Rudolf Virchow, 1821 to 1902, combined clinical observation with laboratory research. Virchow's cellular pathology explained diseases as disorders at the cellular level, a new paradigm that revolutionized the understanding of pathology. At the same time, pharmacology developed. Substances such as morphine, derived from opium, chloroform, and cocaine were used medicinally. Chemical analysis made it possible to isolate active ingredients and use them in a targeted manner. This made drug therapy more precise and effective. Public health care also made great progress. In fast-growing cities, poor hygiene conditions led to cholera epidemics and typhus. Doctors and politicians began to understand clean drinking water, sewagery, and waste disposal as crucial health measures. Social hygienists such as Virchow demanded that medicine not only fight the disease, but also the social causes of illness. The 19th century was thus a time in which all areas of medicine were transformed: theory, clinic, surgery, pharmacy, and public health. For the first time, an image of medicine emerged that comes close to today's ideas: scientifically sound, technically supported, and socially organized. If you look at the centuries before, the 19th century seems like an explosion of knowledge. Within a few decades, medicine changed from a mixture of tradition, experience, and hypotheses to a modern science that systematically researched man, his diseases, and their causes. This laid the foundation for 20th century medicine, with its own triumphs and challenges. Chapter 16: Surgery and Anesthesia: The Fight Against Pain and Death. Surgery has a special place in the history of medicine. For a long time, it was considered the crafty subject of the healing arts, which was associated more with baths and surgeons than with scholars. In the 19th century, however, it began to change fundamentally, not least due to two decisive developments: the introduction of anesthesia and the use of antiseptic and aseptic methods. Together, they enabled a completely new dimension of surgery and made surgery one of the leading disciplines of modern medicine. Before the discovery of anesthesia, operations were an ordeal. Patients were held while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible. Speed was more important than precision, because every cut meant immeasurable pain. Even small interventions were dangerous, and many people shied away from surgery for fear of agony and death. This changed abruptly in the middle of the 19th century. In 1846, William T.G. Morton performed the first operation with ether anesthesia in Boston, an event that is considered the birth of modern anesthesia. Just 1 year later, in 1847, James Young Simpson used chloroform as an anesthetic in Scotland. Suddenly, it was possible to render patients unconscious during an operation and operate painlessly. This discovery revolutionized surgery. Now it was possible to take time, work precisely, and dare to perform complicated procedures that would have been impossible before. But the anesthesia only solved one of the big problems. The second was the risk of infection. Surgical wounds often became infected, and many patients died of sepsis, even if the procedure was initially successful. It was here that Joseph Lister brought about the decisive turning point in the 1860s. Inspired by Pasteur's germ theory, he began to disinfect instruments, bandages, and hands with carbolic acid. The mortality rate after surgery dropped drastically, and antisepsis was soon adopted throughout Europe. Later, this developed into asepsis, complete sterility through sterile clothing, instruments, operating theaters. Anesthesia and antisepsis laid the foundation for making surgery a precise, plannable, and successful discipline. Surgeons could now perform operations that would have been unthinkable before. Amputations under controlled conditions, abdominal surgery, surgery on the skull. Step by step, the repertoire expanded. New instruments and techniques have also been developed. Operating theaters were standardized. Instruments were made of steel and sterilized in autoclaves. Anesthesiologists, a completely new profession, took responsibility for the consciousness and vital functions of patients. This made the operation a team process based on collaboration and clear procedures. Advances in surgery had far-reaching consequences. Diseases that previously meant a certain death sentence could now be treated. Appendicitis, tumors, injuries, all of this moved into the realm of possibility. At the same time, the reputation of surgeons increased. What was once considered a craft activity has now become a highly specialized science. Names such as Theodor Billroth, the pioneer of abdominal surgery, or Ernst von Bergmann, one of the founders of asepsis, became symbols of this progress. But anesthesia also continued to develop. Soon, safer remedies were sought, as ether and chloroform had significant side effects. Laughing gas, morphine, and later modern anesthetics expanded the possibilities. At the same time, local anesthesia developed, for example through the use of cocaine as a narcotic. This made it possible to block nerves in a targeted manner and make certain parts of the body pain-free without putting the whole patient under anesthesia. Surgery in the 19th century was thus a struggle on two fronts, against pain and against death by infection. Both battles were won with the means of science. The combination of anesthesia, antisepsis, and aseptic techniques created a new medicine that could no longer only alleviate but actively intervene. In retrospect, it becomes clear that surgery in the 19th century was not simply one discipline among many, but transformed medicine as a whole. It made visible what was possible when science, technology, and medical art were combined. And it led medicine into a new era, an era in which the scalpel was no longer feared, but understood as a tool of healing. Chapter 17: Medicine in the 20th Century. Antibiotics, radiology, and new therapies. The 20th century is rightly considered a century of medical triumphs. Never before had humanity experienced such rapid progress in diagnosis, therapy, and prevention. A discipline that was still often helpless in the face of infections and chronic ailments in the 19th century became a modern science that cured diseases that had previously meant a certain death sentence. At the same time, medicine profoundly changed people's lives. It extended life expectancy, improved quality of life, and always faced new challenges. A decisive breakthrough was the discovery of antibiotics. In 1928, Alexander Fleming accidentally observed that a mold inhibited the growth of bacteria. This was used to develop penicillin, which was produced on a large scale from the 1940s onwards. This drug could be used to treat infections such as pneumonia, syphilis, or gangrene, which were often fatal before. Other antibiotics such as streptomycin, tetracyclines, or cephalosporins soon followed. Infection medicine experienced a revolution. Diseases that entire generations had feared became curable. Radiology developed at the same time. Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen discovered the rays named after him in 1895, and they were soon used for diagnosis. Bone fractures, foreign bodies, or tumors could be made visible without opening the body. Later, radiation was also used therapeutically, for example, to treat cancer. Radiology developed further into computed tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, and ultrasound, thus fundamentally changing diagnostics. Surgery also reached new dimensions in the 20th century. Thanks to modern anesthesia, sterile techniques, and new equipment, interventions were dared to be carried out that were previously unthinkable. Heart surgery, organ transplants, neurosurgical procedures. In 1967, Christian Barnard performed the first successful heart transplant, an event that caused a sensation worldwide. At the same time, minimally invasive procedures were developed, in which small incisions and camera technology reduced the burden on the patient. Pharmacology also experienced an explosion. In addition to antibiotics, insulin therapies for diabetics, cortisone preparations, psychotropic drugs, and chemotherapies against cancer were created. Vaccines against polio, measles, or tetanus saved millions of lives. The discovery of sulfonamides in the 1930s and antivirals in the second half of the century broadened the spectrum. Psychiatry also changed profoundly. With the introduction of psychotropic drugs such as chlorpromazine in the 1950s, severe mental illnesses could be treated with medication for the first time. At the same time, psychotherapeutic methods continued to develop, from Freud's psychoanalysis to behavioral therapy to modern integrative approaches. Psychiatry thus changed from a discipline of custody to a discipline of treatment. Medicine in the 20th century was also strongly influenced by technical innovations. Heart-lung machines, dialysis machines, incubators for premature babies, or ventilators changed intensive care medicine. People were able to survive in situations that would have been fatal in the past. Modern emergency medicine, supported by rescue services and resuscitation techniques, saved lives every day. Public health care also made enormous progress. Campaigns against smallpox, which was officially considered eradicated in 1980, showed the power of coordinated medicine. Vaccination programs dramatically reduced child mortality. Hygiene standards in cities prevented epidemics, and life expectancy increased significantly worldwide. But the 20th century brought not only successes, but also new challenges. The discovery of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s showed that infectious diseases had not been defeated despite antibiotics and vaccines. Resistance to antibiotics became a growing problem. In addition, chronic diseases such as cancer, heart attacks, or diabetes came to the fore, which required new approaches. The medicine of the 20th century was thus a century of extremes: triumphant victories over diseases, technological advances of unimaginable proportions, and, at the same time, new dangers that relativized trust in the omnipotence of medicine. Nevertheless, this century laid the foundation for today's medicine, a science based on research, technology, and international exchange, and a practice that profoundly changes people's lives. Chapter 18: Psychiatry and Psychology: The Discovery of the Soul as a Field of Research. For a long time, the history of medicine focused almost exclusively on the body: organs, bones, blood, and diseases that could be seen and felt. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, a new field began to develop that was at least as important: the medicine of the soul. Psychiatry and psychology became the focus of scientific attention and fundamentally changed the understanding of illness, health, and being human. In earlier times, mental illnesses were usually stigmatized. People with delusions, depression, or epileptic seizures were often considered possessed or possessed by demons. They were kept in monasteries, housed in poorhouses, or ostracized by society. It was not until the Enlightenment that a change in thinking was introduced. Doctors such as Philippe Pinel, 1745 to 1826 in France, called for a more humane approach. Pinel had the chains of patients in the Bixefs institution in Paris loosened and founded a reform movement that no longer regarded the mentally ill as criminals, but as patients. The 19th century was the birth of scientific psychiatry. Emil Kraepelin, 1856 to 1926, developed a classification of mental illnesses that laid the foundation for modern diagnostic systems. He made a clear distinction between schizophrenia, manic-depressive illness, and other disorders. Kraepelin's systematic observations made psychiatry an empirical discipline based on clinical criteria. At the same time, psychoanalysis emerged, which opened up a completely new view of the soul. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, developed the theory of the unconscious, which decisively determines human behavior.
His methods, dream interpretation, free association, analysis of transference and resistance, gave psychotherapists tools to uncover mental conflicts. Freud was controversial, but his ideas had a profound impact on the 20th century. The idea that psychological symptoms could be an expression of unconscious conflicts changed not only medicine, but also literature, art, and society. Psychology developed as a science in its own right during this time. Wilhelm Wundt founded the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig in 1879 and made psychology an empirical discipline. Researchers such as William James in the USA or Jean Piaget in Switzerland contributed to the systematic study of thinking, feeling, and behavior. Soon, different schools emerged. The behaviorists, who emphasized behavior, such as John B. Watson or B.F. Skinner, the Gestalt psychologists, who studied perception and structures, or the humanists such as Carl Rogers, who emphasized the self-realization of the human being. In the 20th century, psychiatry and psychology developed further apart and yet also together. Psychiatry remained more closely connected to medicine, with a focus on biological causes, drugs, and clinical treatment. Psychology, on the other hand, encompassed a broad field of research, counseling, and therapy. With the introduction of psychotropic drugs in the 1950s, such as antidepressants or neuroleptics, psychiatry received new tools that alleviated many ailments and enabled patients to live in society again. At the same time, modern psychotherapy emerged in many variants. In addition to psychoanalysis, behavioral therapy, talk therapy, cognitive approaches, and systemic methods were introduced. This diversity reflected the realization that mental illnesses are complex and require different approaches. The discovery of the soul as a field of research also had a social dimension. Dealing with the mentally ill became a benchmark for humanity. The major institutional reforms of the 20th century attempted to overcome isolation and integrate patients into society. In many countries, outpatient clinics, counseling centers, and community therapies were established. Today, it is evident that the history of psychiatry and psychology is a history of the rapprochement of body and soul. Neuroscience, imaging, and genetics make it clear that mental disorders also have biological foundations. At the same time, the human being remains a social and spiritual being whose suffering cannot be explained by medication alone. Psychiatry and psychology added a decisive dimension to medicine. They made it visible that health is more than the absence of physical illness. They asked about meaning, conflicts, relationships, and identity. In doing so, they opened up medicine to the whole complexity of the human being.
Chapter 19. Medicine in the Age of High Technology, Transplants, Genetic Engineering, Digitization. The late 20th and early 21st centuries ushered medicine in a new age. Technologies that previously seemed to be the preserve of science fiction became reality. Surgical robots, organ transplants, artificial joints, digital imaging, and genome analyses radically changed the self-image of the art of healing. The doctor was no longer just a healer at the bedside, but also a user of highly complex technologies, a navigator in the interplay of man, machine, and science. One of the most spectacular developments was transplant medicine. With the successful kidney transplant in the 1950s, a new era began. Soon, liver, heart, and lung transplants followed. Christian Barnard's heart transplant in Cape Town in 1967 was celebrated worldwide as a medical miracle. The introduction of immunosuppressants such as cyclosporin in the 1980s made it possible for patients to survive organ transplants in the long term. In this way, medicine proved not only its technical but also its ethical capabilities. Questions about donor organs, justice, and the value of life became the focus of public debate. At the same time, genetics developed into a key area. Since the discovery of DNA structure by James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953, the understanding of genetic material has revolutionized medicine. The Human Genome Project, which was completed in 2003, completely mapped the human genome. Suddenly, it seemed possible to explain diseases at the molecular level, diagnose genetic defects, and perhaps even treat them. Genetic tests opened up new possibilities in prevention, but also new ethical questions. To what extent can the human genome be decoded and manipulated? Biotechnology has produced therapies that were unimaginable just a few decades ago. Monoclonal antibodies, gene therapy, stem cell research, all of these change the treatment of cancer, autoimmune diseases, or rare genetic defects. Diseases that had long been considered incurable moved into the realm of possibility. At the same time, there was growing concern that people would become creators in their own bodies, a challenge for medical ethics and society. Digitization has also fundamentally changed medicine. Computed tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, and PET scans allow detailed insights into the body. Surgical robots such as the Da Vinci system enable precise interventions with minimal incisions. Electronic patient data, telemedicine, and AI-supported diagnoses are changing everyday life in clinics and practices. Today's doctors no longer work with stethoscopes and scalpels alone, but with databases, algorithms, and high-tech devices. High technology has made intensive care medicine a central area. Ventilators, artificial hearts, dialysis, and organ replacement procedures save millions of lives every day. But at the same time, there is a growing discussion about when life should be medically prolonged and when dignity and self-determination take priority. Medicine in the age of high technology is thus a medicine of possibilities and of ambivalences. It can heal, save, and prolong more than ever before, but it must also deal with new questions. How fairly are innovations distributed? Who decides on the use of life-prolonging measures? And how do you preserve the human in a world that is increasingly determined by technology? Thus, this chapter of history shows that progress is not only liberation, but also responsibility. High technology has pushed the boundaries of what is feasible, but the boundaries of what is morally justifiable must be renegotiated again and again. Chapter 20. Outlook: The Medicine of the Future. AI, Personalized Therapies, and Ethical Issues. At the beginning of the 21st century, medicine is at a threshold. The advances of the past centuries have made it a science that can prolong life, alleviate suffering, and cure diseases that once seemed insurmountable. But the future promises not only more of what we already know, but fundamental changes that could redefine the relationship between doctor, patient, and society. A central field is personalized medicine. Instead of applying standardized therapies for all patients, it aims to tailor treatments to individual genetic, molecular, and biological conditions. With the help of genetic analyses and biomarkers, therapies can be developed that are precisely tailored to the patient's profile. This potential is already evident in oncology in particular. Drugs specifically intervene in the signaling pathways of tumor cells and increase the chances of recovery. But these developments also raise questions. How do you deal with sensitive genetic data? Will such therapies be accessible to all people or only to the wealthy? A second field is artificial intelligence, AI. Algorithms are already analyzing radiological images, recognizing patterns in genome data, or suggesting treatment options. AI can evaluate large amounts of data faster and more precisely than a human can. It could relieve the doctor and improve diagnoses. But it also raises ethical questions. Who is responsible if an algorithm makes a wrong decision? Should the machine only provide support, or should it also be allowed to decide? Telemedicine and digital networking are also opening up new horizons. Patients can transmit their vital signs via apps, chronically ill people can be cared for from home, and medical services that were previously unreachable are becoming available in remote regions. This is associated with the hope of more justice and the danger that technical access will create new inequalities. Regenerative medicine, based on stem cell research and tissue engineering, could one day replace lost organs or cure degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's.
At the same time, CRISPR and other genetic technologies are coming into focus. The possibility of changing the genetic material in a targeted manner. What starts as a cure for genetic diseases could quickly lead to the optimization of healthy people. This is where the question of the limits of medicine becomes particularly urgent. The ethical dimension is also gaining in importance. If medicine can prolong life, how far should it go? Who decides when therapy makes sense and when it doesn't? Demographic change in many countries poses enormous challenges for societies. An aging population needs medical care while resources are limited. The medicine of the future will therefore not only be a technical task, but also a moral one. It will have to find answers to questions about justice, responsibility, and human dignity. It will have to decide whether it serves man or changes him. One thing is certain, however, the history of medicine has always been a story of courage, error, curiosity, and hope. It began with shamans and herbs, led through Hippocrates and Galen, through monasteries, laboratories, and operating theaters to genomes and robots. The future will add new chapters that we can only guess at today. The medicine of the coming decades may cure diseases that we still consider invincible. It will help people to live longer and healthier. But she will also keep asking the old question: what does it mean to be healthy, and what does it mean to be human?